I'm not sure about you, but over these past several weeks, it feels like profound grief to me. Like grief from the loss of a loved one or a career or a relationship. The news of Archbishop McCarrick and the Attorney General's report, knowing that there will be more revelations in the future, it just feels like grief, profound loss. Some of the emotions associated with grief, some people call them the stages of grief, have come flooding back to me. Denial, anger, depression, acceptance. Not accepting the injustice of abuse, the silencing and ignoring of the victims, but beginning to come to terms with our current state of affairs. And in that, trying to navigate, trying to find a new normal. So today I offer three trains of thought, three things for us to pray and discern over in the coming weeks. One, some lessons that the Lord has brought to me through loss and grief of my own that are helping me navigate the current situation. And two, like Joshua and Jesus in today's readings, to bring us to a vital point of decision, but wrapped in the context of our lived experience. And three, offer a glimpse of perhaps a few things that I think are going to look very different going forward as a result of these events. So first, lessons learned that are helping me navigate this. When a deep, fervent prayer went unanswered, I became bitter and God distant. Looking for reasonable answers to unreasonable experiences, it drove me crazy and it made me miserable. And like Job, I laid my questions before God. Where were you? Why didn't you do something about this? And like Job, those questions went unanswered. Through loss and suffering, my faith has been tested and even shaken. But there came a turning point in that journey, a realization that to continue to draw away was death, allowing the source of life himself to be slowly cut off, like a river over time being dammed up by a family of beavers. What once flowed freely was becoming a mere trickle in my life. And in my grief, there was never a reasonable answer or explanation to unreasonable circumstances. And we will not find one here either. But eventually in my heart, I heard God say, "Steve, you're asking the wrong question. It's not why, but who." And the who is a God who suffers with us. Last week, Father Prentice opened his homily with the story of a woman who was given a word from the Lord for her pastor. When they sat down over coffee so she could share this word with him, she just started to weep, tears flowing. A wounded woman sitting in front of that pastor, weeping for a long time. Eventually, she got up and started to offer her goodbyes, and the pastor was bewildered. What's the word the Lord gave you for me? She said, that was it. God weeps with you. We have a suffering God. We have a God who weeps with us. And I have asked God in a very occasionally accusatory tone, where were you when my father was suffering with cancer? Where were you when my family was being broken by addiction? Where were you when these innocent children were being hurt and their stories ignored and covered up? And in the quiet corner of my heart, he gave me an answer. My body was racked with cancer with your father. And I was being broken with your family by addiction. And I was being hurt and violated with those innocent children. That's who I am. That's the incarnation. I am not a distant and aloof God, Steve. I am not even in the front row as a spectator cheering you on. I'm a God with you. I am in everything with you. And that's what Joshua is talking to his people about in today's first reading. In a part of the reading that we don't hear today, Joshua is reminding the people of God's journey with their ancestors and his journey with them. Even when they abandoned him, even when they were worshiping other gods and crying out in the desert to be carried back to slavery, their relationship being sold for a few scraps of food from the Egyptians. Even though they turned their backs on God, he never abandoned them. And even though I ran and turned my back, he never abandoned me. And it was in my unfaithfulness that I came to know by experience the faithfulness of our God. So today, Joshua and Jesus ask, whom will you serve? Will you leave too? And by way of a long, long overdue reckoning, we are brought, like the Israelites and the disciples, to a vital point of decision. It was about 5 weeks ago when these heartbreaking events started to become public. It was about that same time that we entered into this bread of life discourse, kicked off by Jesus feeding the 5,000, not counting the women and children. And during this period of his ministry, as we've heard over the weeks, these past weeks in these readings, the number of people hanging around Jesus started to decline rapidly. From thousands on a hillside outside Jerusalem to several boats filled with people following him to Capernaum, to today, when Jesus is left with the 12. Those 12 men, eyeball to eyeball with Jesus Christ. One question: will you leave too? So the question Jesus asked them is before each of us today. Knowing I weep with you, knowing I suffer with you, knowing I'm broken with you, knowing I went to the cross, the most horrific place on the planet, for you. You've experienced my presence in some of your deepest, darkest moments of life. You know who I am. You know who you are to me. Will you leave? Some have left, and some will. and I don't judge them. These are questions that each one of us must answer, as the apostles did that day. To whom shall we go? Lord, you have the words of eternal life. For those of us who do stay, I promise you that this will get tougher. Just one, for instance, making the sign of the cross in public to say grace before our meals. I suspect in the future it's going to draw unwelcome stares and comments and maybe even ridicule. And even as it gets tougher, as the moral voice of many of our bishops is further compromised, Jesus needs our witness more now than ever. You and I, if we don't step up to radical discipleship, to a witness to the world of God's love and His faithfulness, there is no way they're going to hear it. In the future, when we try to share the gospel with other people, when we try to share our story of who God has been and who He is for us, some are going to say, yeah, but look what your shepherds did, and I don't blame them. There is no reasonable answer to these unreasonable events. Death, suffering, abusing of innocent people are unreasonable and were never, ever part of God's plan. All you and I can do, the thing that we must do, is give witness to a God who loves us, who desires friendship with His children so much that He took on flesh and allowed Himself to be broken and abused and ignored, never leaving us abandoned. This is a very, very deep wound that will not go away. This is a wound that I suspect will be opened over time again and again. And this is a wound that we need to learn how to carry together. God, whose heart is broken for His children, the gospel of love and life, needs your witness, my witness, now more than ever. Bishop Flores, when he was our auxiliary bishop here in Detroit several years ago, said this: in the end, there is God, life and love, or death and nothing. So as much as this feels like death and loss, Jesus asks us today, I place before you love and life, or death and nothing. Which will you choose?